Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in OCR A-level history, focusing on Russia and its rulers, and focusing in this lesson, continuing on the discussion about the impacts of wars and revolutions on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. This lesson is going to talk about the impact of the Russo-Japanese War, a war that was relatively shortly fought. It wasn't that long, just like the Crimea War to a lesser extent. But was, or to a greater extent, should I say, but was significant in terms of its far-reaching consequences for both Russia in a domestic sense and in an international sense. So we will talk about the military and strategic consequences, we'll talk about the political consequences, we'll talk about the social and economic consequences as well, and then think finally about the international consequences. So thinking about the result from an international relations kind of perspective. Now, the Russo-Japanese War was a conflict that was fought between the Russian Empire and Japan, and it was fought between 1904 and 1905. The conflict marked a pivotal point in specifically Russian history, and also in the sort of prestige of the Imperial Japanese, and it essentially was a defeat, a humiliating defeat for Russia. And that's where we're going to really begin. We'll begin by thinking about the strategic and military consequences of such a conflict. As I've just mentioned, the Russo-Japanese War ends in a humiliating defeat for Russia. Despite the fact that the Russian Empire was one of the largest and most powerful in the world at the time, it had bounced back quite significantly from the Crimean War, for example. Its military was decisively beaten by the Japanese. The Japanese was a much smaller and it was a far less industrialized nation, but still nevertheless was able to exact a major military and strategic blow to the Russians. Key battles such as the Battle of Tsushima, where the Russian fleet was almost entirely destroyed, or even the Siege of Port Arthur, were crushing blows on Russia's military prestige specifically. The result is that there is an overall undermining of the confidence, the military confidence in the Russian army, the Russian military campaigns. It shattered this myth of Russian invincibility, and it exposed very, very deep flaws in Russia's military organization. The defeat fundamentally revealed the reality, which was that the military was outdated, the military was ill-equipped, and the military was not prepared for the kind of modern conflicts that was taking place at the time in 1904 and 1905. The Navy in particular was a significant embarrassment for the Russians. The Russian fleet's strategic failure led to the loss of its Pacific fleet, and this is seen as one of the most damaging and most horrific naval disasters in all of history. There is also a diminishing of imperial ambitions. Russia's imperial ambitions, essentially in Asia, were deeply harmed by the defeat. The war had been fought primarily over territorial disputes that existed in both Korea and Manchuria, and Russia's defeat meant that it lost control over these kinds of regions. It lost control to Japan. The Japanese was able to exert more influence and control. The loss limited Russia's ability to expand its influence into East Asia, and it weakened its status as a global imperial power. From a political perspective, there are a couple of examples or a couple of illustrations of what the Russo-Japanese War did. The first is that it leads to a rise of revolutionary movements. The humiliating defeat causes widespread dissatisfaction among all parts of the Russian population, and many of these losses were seen as a sign of the empire's complete incompetence and failure to do anything successfully. It led to a sense of disillusionment, which contributed to the rising of political unrest, which had been brewing for decades due to economic hardships and social inequalities. And we know that there is radical opposition as early as Nicholas I and Alexander II, And these kinds of disillusionment with the empire, with autocracy, with the czars, for example, is starting to bubble up more and more. And things like the Russo-Japanese War and the loss of the Russo-Japanese War only serves to solidify these kinds of tensions. The result is that probably one of the most important political and social consequences is that the Russo-Japanese War was crucial in triggering the 1905 revolution. The loss exacerbated popular discontent, which then led to mass protests, it led to mass strikes and to uprisings. The revolution was fueled by discontent with the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas II, and also things like poor working conditions and the absence of things like political freedoms, but it goes without saying that the failure of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War is one of those major points of inflection when we think about the causes of the 1905 revolution. And the 1905 revolution was significant because while it didn't necessarily overthrow the monarchy, Tsar Nicholas II stays in power until 1917, for example, it still made him essentially forced him to make major concessions. So things like the creation of the Duma, a legislative assembly, and the issuance of the October Manifesto, which promised further reforms. We'll get to the 1905 revolution in the next lesson because that's one of the other sort of case studies of wars and revolutions that we're going to explore. There is also this view, of course, that the Tsar's handling of the war was widely criticised. He failed, for example, to prepare adequately for the conflict, and we can couple this with just the fact that there were crushing defeats, meant that many of those lost faith in his leadership, and the war exposes his inability to effectively govern or to make sound military decisions, something that also becomes a problematic element of his running of the military in the First World War as well. From an economic perspective, we can see that there are, of course, three different effects that are had as the result of the Russo-Japanese War. There is a financial burden, the cost of mobilizing and sustaining the military, and the defeat itself drains the state's resources. The war also disrupts Russia's trade and industrial production, especially in the Far East, leading to a sense of economic dislocation. The efficiency of Russian logistics, for example, and the failure to establish a functioning supply chain exacerbated the economic difficulties. We also see the loss of many valuable resource access in the Far East and in East Asia, which again further harms economic prospects. Additionally, and finally, should I say that while the war itself was a drain on resources, it nevertheless did lead to some technological and industrial advancements, specifically within the military. It was high time that the military needed to absolutely reform, and it absolutely sought to do so. It highlighted further the need for modernization, just like the Crimean War did many decades prior. And it led to reforms to catch up with the sort of Western industrial nations, but these would ultimately come too late to prevent the immediate crisis of 1905. And while they were more impactful when thinking about the First World War in 1914 to 1917, they ultimately don't result in a success for the Russians in that conflict either. The defeat of the Russians by the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War also leads to a surge in nationalism and a rise of xenophobia, particularly among those who sought to restore Russian prestige. This outcome was seen as a humiliation. Some of the elements of Russian society, therefore, blamed the loss on perceived internal weaknesses and lack of national unity. So not just xenophobia and racism against Japanese, but also the fact that there was a culture of anti-foreign sentiment, especially towards Japan, but also towards many members of Jewish communities as well. The Russian aristocracy was also affected by the defeats. Many in the nobility who had been supportive of the war saw the failure as a blow to their status and to their particular social standing. The elite was forced to confront the limitations of their authority, and many Russian officers and officials were blamed for the military's failures. We then start to see a major shift in global power dynamics. It was the first time in all of history that an Asian nation had defeated a European power in the modern era. This is a significant moment in world history, and it signified the rise of Japan as a military power, and it specifically represented a decline in the influence of Russia in the Pacific. So, we've been thinking about the impact of the Russo-Japanese War, specifically on Russia, because of course we're studying Russia. But just think about the counter argument. Think about the impact that it had on Japan, the rise of Japanese nationalism, the kinds of Japanese nationalism that ultimately contributes to the significant growth of Japan in terms of its own perceived prestige and its own internal understanding of itself. When we start getting into the 1930s and we start getting into the Japanese invasion of China and the role that Japan plays in the Second World War. The war itself then demonstrates the emergence of Japan as a force to be reckoned with within East Asia, and it raises questions about the long-term viability of Russia as a major power. Now, ultimately, there was diplomatic consequences. We can see that the Russo-Japanese War ultimately ends with the Treaty of Portsmouth. The Treaty of Portsmouth was mediated by US President Theodore Roosevelt or Teddy Roosevelt, for those of you who may be confused. The treaty recognized that Japan had dominance over Korea and also recognized the interest of Japan in Manchuria, and again marks a major shift in the balance of power in the region. The diplomatic standing of Russia was damaged, and its ability to project power was severely curtailed.